Imagine the most peaceful day of your life. A picnic with family, the sun shining, children playing in the forest, the sound of birds singing. Now imagine all of that being destroyed in a fraction of a second by a weapon that traveled more than 5,000 miles through the air, without a pilot, without an engine, without anyone controlling it. On May 5th, 1945, 6 people died on American soil for the only time during the entire Second World War by direct enemy action. And the scariest part? The weapon that killed these people was launched from the other side of the world weeks earlier. Can you imagine dying because of something that crossed an entire ocean by itself? This is the story of the Fugo Project, one of the most bizarre and at the same time most ingenious military operations of World War II. And I guarantee you never heard about this in history class. Stay with me, because this story is going to blow your mind. Let's go back to Japan in 1942. The Japanese Empire was in total war against the United States. Do you remember what happened at Pearl Harbor? Well, after that attack, the Americans were thirsty for revenge. And in April 1942, just a few months after Pearl Harbor, something happened that deeply humiliated the Japanese. Have you ever heard of the Doolittle Raid? It was when the Americans did something considered impossible. They managed to put bombers on an aircraft carrier, flew straight to Japan, and bombed Tokyo for the first time in history. It might seem like a small thing today, but back then it was a massive shock. Japan had always considered itself untouchable, protected by the ocean. Suddenly, bombs were falling on the capital. The morale of the Japanese people hit rock bottom. Now think about this. If you were a Japanese general back then, what would you do? Japan wanted to retaliate, wanted to attack the American mainland, but there was a huge problem. Do you know what it was? Japanese planes couldn't fly across the entire Pacific. It was more than 5,000 miles of ocean. No plane of that era had enough fuel to make that trip. And Japanese aircraft carriers? Forget it. The American Navy was patrolling everything. Any aircraft carrier that approached the American coast would be sunk in minutes. So the Japanese were in an impossible situation. They wanted to attack America, but how? That's when someone had a crazy idea. Have you ever stopped to think about how wind works? There are air currents up high, very high, that travel at absurd speeds around the planet. Today we call these currents the jet stream. Japanese scientists discovered that these air currents traveled directly from Japan to the United States, passing over the Pacific. And they had an idea that seemed like total madness. What if we put bombs on balloons and let the wind carry them to America? Sounds absurd, right? Would you trust your weapon to the wind? But the Japanese were desperate, and this crazy idea turned into the Fugo Project. Now, you must be thinking, how the hell is a balloon going to cross 5,000 miles of ocean without falling? Good question. The Japanese thought of everything. These weren't ordinary party balloons. They were extremely sophisticated contraptions for the time. Each balloon was almost 43 feet in diameter. Think of a balloon the size of a 4-story building. They were made of paper. That's right, paper. But it wasn't ordinary paper. It was traditional Japanese paper called washi, made from fibers of specific plants. This paper was incredibly resistant. Women and even school-age children worked gluing layer after layer of this paper with a special glue made from potatoes. Can you believe it? Children building weapons of war. Each balloon was inflated with hydrogen, the same gas that made the Hindenburg airship fly. But hydrogen is dangerous as hell, extremely flammable. But it was light, and that was essential. The balloon needed to climb very high, up to 33,000 feet altitude, where the jet stream currents were. Up there, the wind traveled at speeds of up to 185 miles per hour. At that speed, the balloon would take only 3 days to cross the entire Pacific. 3 days! Can you imagine? A weapon leaving Japan and arriving in California in 72 hours, without an engine, without a pilot, without anything. But here comes the genius part. How would the balloon maintain the right altitude for 3 days? During the day, the sun heated the gas inside the balloon and it rose. During the night, the gas cooled and the balloon descended. If there was no control, the balloon would go up and down until it exploded or fell into the ocean. Japanese engineers solved this problem in a brilliant way. Do you know how? They created an automatic system using altimeters, those instruments that measure altitude. The balloon had dozens of sandbags hanging underneath it. When the balloon descended too much below 30,000 feet, the altimeter automatically released a sandbag. The balloon became lighter and rose again. When the balloon rose too much, above 36,000 feet, a valve opened and let some gas escape. The balloon became heavier and descended. Everything automatic, with no one controlling it. After 3 days in the air crossing the entire Pacific, it was showtime. The balloon had a timer system, a mechanical chronometer that counted the hours. When it reached about 64 hours of flight, the timer activated an explosive fuse. This fuse released all the bombs at once. Each balloon carried one 33-pound anti-personnel bomb and 4 smaller 11-pound incendiary bombs. The incendiary bombs were made to start massive forest fires. The idea was that if they fell in the forests of Oregon, California, Washington State, they would turn everything into hell. And you know what the most sinister part of the plan was? September and October in the American West were dry months, everything ready to catch fire. The Japanese studied all of this. They wanted to create panic, fear, force the Americans to divert resources from the war to put out fires and search for balloons. Between November 1944 and April 1945, the Japanese launched something between 9,000 and 9,300 balloons. You heard that right. 9,300 flying unmanned weapons crossing the largest ocean on the planet. It was the first weapon with intercontinental range in the history of humanity. Think about that. Decades before ballistic missiles, the Japanese had created a weapon that could hit another continent. But there was a problem. Do you think 9,000 balloons reached America? Not even close. Most fell into the ocean. Others exploded in the air. Others got lost in the wind currents. It's estimated that only about 1,000 balloons, maybe 10% of the total, managed to reach American and Canadian territory. 1,000 balloons. Do you think that's little? Imagine 1,000 bombs falling randomly over a giant territory. Total chaos, right? But here comes the surprise. The balloons were an almost complete failure. You know why? Because the Japanese calculated everything wrong. They thought the balloons would arrive in America in September and October, in the driest season. But because of production delays, the balloons only started being launched in November. November, December, January, February, March, April. These months are rainy and snowy in the northwestern United States. The forests were wet. When the incendiary bombs fell, they exploded, started small fires, but everything was so humid that the fire simply extinguished itself. No major forest fires were recorded. Can you believe it? All that work, 9,000 balloons, and no serious fires. But the balloons were arriving. The Americans started finding strange debris. The first balloon was seen on November 4th, 1944, floating in the waters near San Pedro, California. The sailors were confused. What the hell was that? Then they found fragments of another balloon near Hawaii. Then in Wyoming, in Montana, in Alaska, in Oregon. Can you imagine the confusion of the Americans? Where were these things coming from? How were they getting there? At first, nobody had any idea. Some thought they were weather balloons that had gone wrong. Others thought they were secret military experiments. But when they examined the debris carefully, they found Japanese characters on the parts. Then it clicked. The Japanese were attacking America from the other side of the ocean. The American government panicked. Not because the balloons were effective, they weren't, but because nobody knew how many balloons were coming, where they would fall, when they would explode. And there was a serious problem. And one of the balloons fell near Hanford in Washington state. Do you know what was in Hanford? The Manhattan Project, the secret factory where the Americans were building the atomic bomb. The balloon fell on a high-voltage line that supplied power to the nuclear reactor. The power went out for a few hours. If the balloon had caused permanent damage, it could have delayed the development of the atomic bomb. Do you realize how this could have changed history? By sheer luck, the engineers managed to restore power quickly. The American military held an urgent meeting. What to do? How to stop these balloons? They had no way to destroy the balloon factories in Japan, because they still didn't know exactly where the balloons were coming from. So they made a genius decision. Can you guess what it was? They decided to do nothing. More specifically, they decided to pretend nothing was happening. The government imposed one of the strictest media blackouts of the war. Newspapers, radios, nobody could talk about the balloons. Not a word. The idea was simple. If the Japanese didn't get confirmation that the balloons were working, they would think the project had failed and they would cancel it. And it worked. The Japanese were launching balloons and receiving no news back. Nothing. Total silence. They had no idea if the balloons were arriving or all falling into the ocean. But here comes the tragedy. That tragedy I mentioned at the beginning. May 5th, 1945. A pastor named Archie Mitchell lived in the small town of Bly in southern Oregon. Bly was a tiny town with only 450 people. A calm, peaceful place far from the war. Archie and his wife Elsie had just gotten married and were excited. Elsie was 5 months pregnant. They wanted to start a family. That Saturday, May 5th, it was a beautiful spring day. Blue sky, sun shining, perfect temperature. Archie decided to have a picnic. He invited his wife and 5 children from his church's Sunday school. The children were between 11 and 14 years old. Sherman Shoemaker, 13 years old. Edward Engen, 13 years old. Jay Gifford, 13 years old. Joan Patsky, 13 years old. And her brother, Dick Patsky, 14 years old. 5 children excited for a day in the countryside. They went to an area called Gearhart Mountain, near a creek called Leonard Creek. Archie parked the car and let Elsie and the children get out to look for a nice place for the picnic while he found a better place to park. Elsie had made a chocolate cake the night before. She was excited. The children were happy, running through the forest, exploring. Archie parked the car and started walking through the forest to find the group. Suddenly, he heard Elsie's voice. She was calling him. Archie, come see. We found something interesting here. Can you imagine the scene? A pregnant woman and 5 curious children finding something strange in the forest. They probably thought it was a weather balloon, something cool to examine, and then it happened. A massive explosion. The sound echoed through the forest. Archie was just a few yards away. He ran desperately. When he reached the site, he saw a scene of horror. His wife Elsie was on fire. He tried to put out the fire, succeeded, but it was too late. She was dead, and the children. All 5 children were dead. Mutilated bodies scattered around the area. Sherman, Edward, Jay, Joan, Dick, all dead. 6 lives erased in 1 second. Archie was in shock. He looked at his own hands. They were yellow. The picric acid from the explosive bomb had stained his hands yellow when he tried to put out the fire on his wife's clothes. His hands remained stained for weeks. Can you imagine the trauma? Seeing your pregnant wife and 5 children killed in front of you by a weapon nobody knew existed? Other men who were working on the road nearby heard the explosion and ran to help. They found Archie in shock, staring at his own hands, rubbing them compulsively. They covered the bodies with pine branches and ran to town to call the authorities. The sheriff arrived, the coroner arrived, and soon after the military arrived. An intelligence officer came straight from Fort Lewis in Washington state. He immediately locked down the area. He ordered the local newspapers not to publish anything specific about the explosion, only that there had been an explosion of unknown origin. The government was still keeping the secret about the balloons, but now there was a problem. 6 people had died, 6 civilians. The only deaths on continental American soil caused by enemy action during the entire Second World War. Do you realize the importance of this? Pearl Harbor was in Hawaii, which at the time was a territory, not a state. But these 6 people died on the continent in Oregon. The first and only American civilian victims killed by enemy attack on continental territory during the entire war. And the worst part? The government realized that the secret had killed these people. If the population had known about the balloon bombs, if they had been warned not to touch strange objects found in the forest, these 6 people would be alive. After the tragedy, the government changed strategy. They released the press to publish information about the balloon bombs, but only public safety information. Warnings for the population not to touch anything strange found in nature. But they still couldn't give many details about how many balloons had been found or where. Even so, the damage was already done. 6 lives lost. Archie Mitchell was devastated. He lost his wife, his unborn child, and 5 children he loved. But the story doesn't end there. Meanwhile, the American military was working frantically to discover where the balloons were coming from. They had pieces of balloons, they had sand from the ballast bags, they had bomb fragments. Scientists and geologists were called in. They started examining the sand. Do you know how sand can tell a story? Every beach in the world has a unique composition of minerals, of small fossilized marine creatures, of diatoms, which are microscopic algae with silica skeletons. The scientists took the sand from the ballast bags and analyzed it under powerful microscopes. They identified specific species of diatoms that only existed on some beaches in Japan. After weeks of analysis, they traced the sand to a specific beach near the city of Ichinomiya on the island of Honshu. Reconnaissance planes were sent. They photographed the area, and they found exactly what they were looking for: 2 large hydrogen production factories near that beach. That's where the balloons were being launched from. American bombers received orders. The factories were destroyed in air attacks. With the hydrogen production capacity destroyed, the balloon bomb program was canceled by the Japanese in April 1945. Ironically, the Bly incident happened in May, a month after the program had already been canceled. The balloon that killed Elsie and the children had been launched weeks before, maybe even months before, and had been stuck somewhere in the Oregon mountains until that fatal day. In total, it's estimated that about 300 to 1,000 balloon bombs were found or observed in American, Canadian, and even Mexican territory. Some reached as far as Michigan State, on the other side of the continent. An absolutely incredible range. But in terms of military effectiveness, the Fugo project was a failure. Very little material damage, no serious forest fires, only 6 deaths. Compare that to the thousands of lives and the enormous amount of resources the Japanese spent on the project. It wasn't worth it, but the project left an important legacy. It was the first intercontinental weapon in history. Decades before ballistic missiles, the Japanese proved it was possible to attack another continent without using planes or ships. Today, at the site where Elsie Mitchell and the 5 children died, there is a monument. The Mitchell Monument, as it's called, is near Bly, Oregon. There's a plaque with the names of the 6 victims. And there's a tree, a ponderosa pine, that still has shrapnel marks from the explosion. The tree survived and is still there, a living testimony of that terrible day. The monument was registered in the National Register of Historic Places of the United States. It's a place of memory, of reflection on the absurd consequences of war. Archie Mitchell, the pastor who lost everything that day, lived the rest of his life with that trauma. But he was a man of faith. Years later, he went back to work as a missionary. He got married again, but tragedy followed him. In 1962, he was working as a missionary in Vietnam when he was killed by Viet Cong guerrillas. A man who survived an experimental Japanese weapon ended up dying in another war on the other side of the world. His life was marked by the violence of war from beginning to end. Have you ever stopped to think about how absurd this project was? 9,300 balloons launched to the wind, literally. The Japanese had no control whatsoever over where the balloons would fall. They could fall in the ocean, They could fall in empty forests. They could fall in cities. It was Russian roulette on a continental scale. And the scariest part? The technology was incredibly advanced for the time. Automatic altitude control systems, mechanical chronometers, precise calculations of air currents at stratospheric altitudes. All of this in 1944, decades before modern computers and the American censorship. It was one of the most successful information control operations in history. The government managed to keep a national secret for months, even with 1,000 balloons falling across the country. Even today, many people have never heard of the Fugo project. Have you ever heard of it? Probably not. This shows the power of censorship and information control in times of war. The Japanese launched 9,000 balloons and never knew if they had caused any damage because the Americans simply didn't let the information leak. Genius, and at the same time, scary. The story of the Fugo project shows us several things. First, that war makes people create things that are incredibly innovative and at the same time absurd. Second, that technological innovation doesn't always mean military effectiveness. The balloons were technologically impressive, but militarily useless. Third, that secrets in war can save lives or can cost lives. Censorship prevented the Japanese from knowing that the balloons were working, which probably saved many American lives by getting the project canceled. But at the same time, the secret cost the lives of Elsie Mitchell and the 5 children because nobody knew they should be careful with strange objects in the forest. And fourth, that the victims of war are often the most innocent people. A pregnant woman and 5 children on a picnic. Couldn't be further from the war. And yet, the war found them. Think about it. While you're living your normal life, doing your things, eating, working, having fun, there's someone somewhere in the world creating new weapons, testing new ways to kill people, planning attacks. World War II ended 80 years ago, but human creativity applied to destruction has never stopped. Today there are drones, hypersonic missiles, cyber weapons. The Fugo project was the ancestor of modern drones. Unmanned weapons that fly by themselves and attack distant targets. 80 years ago, this was science fiction. Today, it's reality. So next time you see a balloon in the sky, remember this story. Remember that not everything that looks harmless is harmless. Remember the 6 people who died in Bly, Oregon on a beautiful spring day. Remember Pastor Archie Mitchell rubbing his yellow-stained hands in total shock. Remember the 9,300 balloons crossing the Pacific, most falling into the ocean, some reaching America, only one causing deaths. And remember that history is full of these forgotten stories, these secret projects, these small tragedies that get lost in the pages of books. World War II was much more than the famous battles, much more than Normandy and Pearl Harbor. It was millions of small stories, like this one, that most people will never know about. Script summary. This script tells the little-known story of the Fugo project, a Japanese military operation during World War II. Between November 1944 and April 1945, Japan launched approximately 9,300 unmanned balloon bombs toward the United States, using jet stream currents to cross the Pacific Ocean. These balloons, made of traditional Japanese paper and equipped with automatic altitude control systems, carried incendiary and explosive bombs with the goal of starting massive forest fires and spreading panic among the American population. The project was retaliation for the Doolittle raid of 1942, when the US bombed Tokyo for the first time. Despite the advanced technology for the time, the project was a military failure. Only about 300 to 1,000 balloons reached American territory, and the wet winter weather conditions prevented the planned forest fires. The American government imposed a strict media censorship, preventing the Japanese from knowing if the balloons were working, which led to the project's cancellation. The central tragedy of the script occurred on May 5, 1945, near Bly, Oregon, when Elsie Mitchell, 26 years old, 5 months pregnant, and 5 Sunday school children, Sherman Shoemaker, Edward Engen, Jay Gifford, Joan Patsky, and Dick Patsky, died when they found a balloon bomb during a picnic. These were the only 6 deaths on continental American soil caused by enemy action during the entire Second World War. Elsie's husband, Pastor Archie Mitchell, witnessed the explosion and was traumatized forever. American scientists managed to trace the origin of the balloons through geological analysis of the sand used as ballast. Identifying specific beaches in Japan, this led to the destruction of the hydrogen factories that fueled the project. The script explores the innovative technological aspects of the balloons, the consequences of war censorship, and the lasting legacy of the Fugo project as the first intercontinental weapon in history, precursor to modern drones.